Um, hopefully you are well versed on the gross anatomy at this point. Please say yes.
Yes.
Good. Yes, you are. I know better. I know better. All right, so we'll start at the very beginning, which is a very good place to start. So I like this notion of the heart as a pump. We tend to think about it like an engine, you know, because as soon as you get going faster, your heart rate picks up necessarily. But the pump analogy is better because that's essentially what you're doing. I mean, what is the purpose of your heart in the first place? You pumps blood through the body, and ours is remarkably efficient. And when you start looking at differences in heart structure across the tree of life, you see that ours is especially efficient because we are separated into 4 different chambers. In other words, you have deoxygenated blood coming in which side? The right, and the oxygenated blood then comes into the left. Well, not all hearts are like that. In some animals, amphibians and reptiles, you have mixing in the bottom chamber. There's 3 instead of 4. Well, that's not efficient because what that means is you're pumping a mixture of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Ours, you don't do that. You get blood returning from the pulmonary circuit, freshly oxygenated, maxed out with the saturation, getting an additional squeeze before it's sent out into the systemic. So we're talking about 75 beats per minute for 108,000 times a day. Pretty intense activity going on there. But you're only injecting about 70 mils of blood per squeeze. And if you remember what those pig hearts look like, even with the left ventricle, it's still not very big. When you look at those models, and it's like you've got this big, giant open space. Most of it's pretty solid muscles. So you're not pumping out a lot, but it's consistent. So it keeps going. So how does it work? Let's find out. You should be up to speed with this. This is just where it is, how it's situated, and what those layers look like. Same thing here, we know about the coverings and all that. Practical application, I love this. Most of the time, what you see on TV where people do chest compressions is not correct. It is aggressive, it is exhausting, and if you do it properly, you're gonna be breaking bones. I mean, that's the long and short of it. 103 beats per minute, why do I have Revolta up here?
Same one.
Yeah, if that's a pretty standard 103 beats per minute kind of song that you can coordinate your compressions to. Incidentally, there is a Queen song that has the same rhythm, but the message is less encouraging. Anybody know what it is?
Another one bites the dust.
There you go, that's it. Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. So yeah, it's the current consensus is if a person is in distress, you're better off to do compressions than you are to breathe. It's more important to keep things circulating. So, all right, chambers and flow. How are we with this? Okay, all right, that's what I need to know. Okay, so this is the part that's hardest to wrap your head. Well, no, it's not. It's one of the first things that's kind of hard to wrap your head around because we tend to think about this as being a flow through. Like, I know, when I was a kid, I would think, well, it's coming in this side and it's coming out that side, but that's not what's happening. You're going in both sides and out both sides. In both sides, out both sides. So the other point that I want to make is your circulatory system is closed. That means you have a continuous, if you imagine, you've got capillaries in your, go back. You got capillaries in the lungs, go back, which is right, here's more systemic, your pulmonary is over here, and then of course your lower body capillaries and what have you. Now, you're covered in capillaries. That picture at the beginning of blood, those are all capillaries. I mean, you're inundated with them. But the system is closed, meaning all of these pipes and all of this tubing is filled with fluid the entire time. Does that make sense? So when you're pushing freshly oxygenated blood out into the systemic circuit, to the brain, to the appendages, everywhere, you're doing that to deliver oxygen, nutrients, whatever, yes? What else leaves the blood vessels? White blood cells can leave. What about the red blood cells? Do they get out? Do they? No, they don't. The red blood cells do not leave circulation. They're not supposed to. If they do, that's a problem. The proteins, remember albumin, the fibrinogens, those big proteins, they do not leave circulation. They stay in there. So we've got gases like oxygen, whatever, leaving. What else leaves along with it? Yeah, but what carries those substances around? Hint, we're 75%.
Water.
It's water, yeah, so when you have circulation going on, and I am making a point with this, by the way, you are perfusing tissues with water and solutes like oxygen, CO2, sodium, what have you. The red blood cells, the albumin and the big proteins stay in circulation. Now here's why that matters. Because you don't want fluid building up out here. And somebody had asked me the question about how does albumin work in terms of osmotic pressure. Well, if you're pushing all that fluid with solutes and what have you out into the tissues, you have to have a way to get it back in. So the albumin sucks that fluid back into circulation where it gets returned ultimately to the heart. So to make a long story short, in order to get blood from the ventricles to wherever they're going, you have to overcome the pressure that's already in the system. You see what I mean? It's kind of like if you want to blow bubbles or you want to blow like a spitball, right, through a straw. Were y'all kids that did this? Yes, you were. I know you were. But if you have to overcome the pressure at the other end. So with every squeeze, you're pushing fluid all the way through. Now, our cardiac cycle always starts with the filling of the right atrium, even though it's happening at the same time. Blood returns from systemic circulation to the right atrium, where then it goes to the ventricle and gets squeezed out. Blood from the right side goes where? Yeah, where is it served? What circulation? Pulmonary. Right side of the heart sends blood to the lungs. Alright, what does the blood do in the lungs? It drops off carbon dioxide, picks up oxygen, and then where does it go? Then it goes to the left atrium and the left ventricle, where it gets squeezed out into systemic circulation. So all of this is happening all at once. The atria fill, the ventricles fill, it all gets squeezed out. Yeah,
So
Ted?
it's leaving the left ventricle, that goes through which valve is that going through?
When it leaves the left ventricle, it goes through the aortic semilunar valve. Yep. Are we good with that? So it's two sides, in, out,
And
on
then you
both
said
sides.
there's some videos on YouTube that help, like, if you watch.
Yeah, if you just look up blood flow, heart, you can actually see how the flow looks and it helps you visualize. This picture shows you the valves as well. So you've got your tricuspid valve here on the right, your bicuspid here on the left, and then there's your aortic semilunar, pulmonary semilunar. And we'll talk more about the valves in a second, but do you understand where the fluid is going? Okay, that's what I wanna know. All right, anatomy we're good with. Musculature, why does the musculature have this weird figure 8 pattern? Why do you think? Yeah, to squeeze in a coordinated way. And if you look at those animations of how the heart actually works, it is a very, very coordinated, tightly coordinated thing. Because if you don't have it functioning as a unit, it's kind of like if you have a set of dominoes or something and there's a space in the line, it doesn't work right. So the heart has to function as a syncytium. So what that means is it's a functional unit. Oh, there it is. I like that word. It's syncytium. The other thing to note about the musculature is that both sides pump the same volume. Even though one is significantly thicker than the other, they're pumping the same amount. Why is that? Why is one thicker than? It's it's gotta go further. The left ventricle has to get blood all the way into systemic circulation. The right one only has to go pulmonary. The pulmonary circuit is a very, very low pressure system. So the right side doesn't have to work very hard. So we'll more on that a little bit. All right, okay, with that, let's look at the valves. We already know the valves are anchored where? What anchors them to the ventricles? Yay, chordae tendineae, very good. So we're looking at the AV valves, which are atrioventricular. On a lab exam, don't call them AV valves, call them tricuspid or bicuspid. The AV valves are fairly passive during ventricular filling. They hang like this. It's like a trap door, okay? So they hang open as blood flows in. But what happens when the ventricles contract? Yeah, you're squeezing, so the blood's gonna have a tendency to wanna shoot up, right, and go backwards. But you don't wanna do that. You don't want backflow back into the atria. So these valves close when the ventricles squeeze. The force of the blood going backwards causes the trap doors to shut. And the papillary muscles keep those doors anchored so they don't blow open. And that is the first heart sound. So the love that you hear is the closing of the AV valves. All right, and so the other set of valves are the semilunars, and they're so called because of how they're shaped. They have a couple of different flaps also, but they're cup shaped, which is kind of neat because what that means is when the ventricles squeeze, these ones close, but what do these ones do? They open. When the pressure in the ventricles exceeds the pressure in the vessel above, like, you gotta overcome the fluid that's already here, right, to make it move. It flows through here, and of course what goes up has to, it wants to come down, and when it does, it fills those little cups and the valve closes. That's your second heart sound. You see how it works? So let's just, you know what, let me see if I can find an animation of that for you. I want to see valve replacement. Let's try this one. No, I don't want to see you either. See how coordinated that is? That's on. Sometimes it's hit or miss with these. But you kind of see what's going on? See how it's both sides in and out? Okay, you can find them that are more continuous. This one, yeah, there's Khan Academy, there's all kinds of stuff. But definitely take the time if you're not clear on how it works. All right. Are we good with sounds and valves? Yeah? Okay. What happens when a valve fails? Yeah, you can have several things cause a valve to fail. And usually that's gonna cause a heart murmur or some kind of a change in the heart sounds. And if you'll notice, your physician listens to you, they're putting the stethoscope in different places. And it's because different places on the chest, you're gonna hear different parts of the heart functioning. So, valve regurgitation, usually it's most common with the mitral valve. Why do you think it would be more common with the mitral than with the bicuspid? Yeah, the pressure differential. The mitral valve's under a lot more pressure than the bicuspid because the bicuspid's pulmonary, so that's a much lower force coming out of the right ventricle. Sometimes the valves can become rigid and calcified. They start getting kind of hardened and less flexible, and that can cause kind of a clicking, weird sound on auscultation. But it can cause a problem because if the valves aren't closing properly, your pumping is not going to be as efficient, and you're going to be causing the heart to work even harder. Can you fix a faulty valve? Yeah, you can. You can get a valve replacement. What do we replace them with? Pig valves. Why don't we have to worry about orchard rejection with that? Because it's avascular and it's acellular. It's connective tissue. Remember? Connective tissue is mostly matrix and fibers. It's not not cellular, so there's no rejection, yeah.
What's the things people get in their heart sometimes that help with their pacemaker?
Yeah.
What exactly does that do?
That's electrical, we're getting there. Alright, hold that thought, that's a good question. Alright. Coronary circulation, we looked at this in the lab. What is the purpose of coronary circulation? This is what's supplying the actual heart muscle. The blood that's being pumped out is not doing anything for the heart itself. It's doing for the heart when it leaves the aorta, again, freshly oxygenated. Notice the circumflex branches of the left and right coronary arteries come directly from the aorta. That's hard to see on those models because it's all tucked underneath, but they're coming directly off it. And so then you have all this blood perfusing the heart and then getting sucked back up into the coronary veins, ultimately the coronary sinus, and then through the SVC. Okay, we all right with this? So then what happens when a person has a heart attack? Yeah, so when you're talking about a person having a blockage, needing a stent, or bypass surgery, or whatever, you're talking about clogged up arteries out here. And you saw on those giant pig hearts, these are small. I mean, think about the crap we eat, it's a wonder we don't all have heart disease. I mean, for real, teeny tiny little bitty vessels. So when they get blocked, you're depriving the cardiac muscle of oxygen. And tissue that is deprived of oxygen does what? It dies. Now, does that mean that you're gonna die right away? No. What's gonna happen to you? When you're not feeding that part of the heart, what's that gonna feel like? You're gonna have some chest pain, especially with activity. As you start making the heart beat faster, if it's not being supplied, you're gonna feel some pain. The other thing is, when that tissue dies, it gets replaced with scar tissue, which is not flexible and does not stretch and does not recoil. It's not elastic. So suddenly, you're not pumping efficiently anymore either. And as that tissue continues to die, it can become a big problem. So it happens as a result of buildup of plaque, fatty acids, blood clots, what have you, can be enough to trigger or clog those arteries. Usually an acute MI, what's MI stand for? Myocardial infarction. Myo referring to the muscle. You're cutting off flow to the muscle. That's not the same thing as cardiac arrest. Arrest is when it stops. So enough of a significant MI, and yeah, it can lead to arrest, but the MI by itself is the deprivation of oxygen and the death of the tissue. That's what most people are referring to when they say heart attack, yeah. Right. And I mean, this is a teeny tiny vessel, and it's pretty well occluded here. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a genetic component plays a bigger role in diet. The biochemist will tell you that it does not matter what you eat, it has to do with how your body processes it. And if you look at hospital records, that's pretty safe to say. My husband has seen 45-year-old people run 5 miles a day, super healthy, 0% body fat, drop dead of a heart attack. And then you've got, 600-pound Jim Bob who stays in bed all day and eats cheeseburgers and hasn't moved or left the house in 3 days, and he lives to be 90. So there is a genetic component to that for sure. So when you have plaque buildup, you get a lack of vessel stretch, and that contributes to a lack of blood flow as well. So atherosclerosis is hardening of the arteries because of plaque buildup and what have you. And the other thing is, smoking, genetics, all of those things can trigger the same type of hardening. All right? All right, so let's look at the structure of the cardiac muscle and the electrical activity. This is a pretty interesting topic because cardiac muscle is different from skeletal. Tell me some of the characteristics that you remember of skeletal muscle. It's voluntary movement, and it requires what to make it do something? It has to have a nerve cell tell it what to do. Cardiac muscle is self-excitable. It does not require an extra nerve to go, hey, you need to contract. It just does it on its own. And the way that it does it is through conducting cells. Notice there's only about 1% of the heart is conducting. The rest of the cells are contractile. Those are the ones that are actually doing the squeezing and stretching and what have you.
So the conducting are the ones that are self-cycle? Not.
Correct. Correct. What else do you notice is different about the structure of skeletal versus cardiac? Yeah, you've got the intercalated discs, and even though it's striated, it's also branched. So these intercalated discs help conduct the electrical impulse, and again, ensure that we're functioning as a syncytium. Because if the beating or pumping is not coordinated, you're not gonna be able to squeeze blood out. So it doesn't matter if the heart's all active, if it's doing this stuff, you can have all sorts of electrical and muscular activity, but you're still not contributing to circulation. See the difference? So it has to be coordinated. All right. As you would expect, cardiac muscle cells are aerobic, which means they require what? Say it loud for the people in the back.
Oxygen.
Yeah, they gotta have oxygen, but we know that cardiac muscle can do without oxygen longer than skeletal muscle can. They are a little bit more tolerant, which is a good thing, which means if you hold your breath, you're not gonna die right away. So they're a little more tolerant to being deprived of oxygen. All right, so far so good. All right. Let's look at the conduction system and how we coordinate the contractions of these muscles. All right, so when we're talking about conduction and electrical impulse, what are we actually referring to? Well, if you had me for A&P1, you'll remember this because it's one of my favorite. You got a cell here. You got sodium potassium pumps all over the place. And you've got proteins in here. And proteins tend to have what charge? Negative, yes. And so if we got a sodium potassium pump, what are we pumping out of that set? Three sodium out, 2 potassium in. Okay, so sodium has what kind of charge? Positive, all right? So we're putting a whole bunch of positive charge out here. My plus signs get less symmetrical the more I make. And then you have leakage channels for potassium. Okay? So given that you're putting all of this positive charge outside the cell, and that you can't get rid of these negative proteins in here, what is the net charge on the inside here? It's negative. Does everybody see why? Yeah? Okay. So if you stuck a voltmeter in there, you would see that in fact, a cell at rest is operating at about negative 70 millivolts. It's just a measure of electricity. All right? So if something happens, let's say these cells get excited. Let's say a stimulus causes the doors to open. Given that there's all that positive outside, where's it gonna go if the doors to the cell open? It's gonna flood inside the cell. How fast? RFF, y'all know what RFF is, right? Real fast. So what's gonna happen to the graph as we let sodium in? It goes up. And then the doors close, and then what happens? It starts to drop. Remember action potential? That's what this is. That's what this is, action potential. The doors close, the cell resets itself, and that's what you get. That's just action potential. But what is it also? It's an EKG. That's what an EKG looks like, because an EKG is measuring electrical impulse in the heart. If you don't have the electricity, what do you also not have? You don't have contraction. So they go hand in hand. All right, and we're going to see how to relate one to the other. So when we talk about action potential, we're talking about an electrical impulse caused by the channels here opening up and allowing sodium to flood in. Is that depolarization or repolarization? It's depolarization. We're polar when we have opposite charges. We got opposite charges here, yes? So as those charges become the same, you are depolarizing, and the sodium channels are open. Then over here, what do you got? Repolarization, which literally means to do what? It has to reset. Before you can have another impulse or another contraction, you have to reestablish this gradient. You gotta have those positive charges outside the cell again so that it'll go the next time. Make sense? Okay. So this is repolarization. Then what are the sodium channels doing here? They're closed. And then for a brief period down here, we're hyperpolarized. We drop down below our resting because it takes a minute for the potassium to equalize and everything to get back to where it's supposed to. All right, you follow? Okay.
Which channels are open when it's when you're polarizing? Is there channels open all the things that are inside and go back
The
out?
sodium potassium pumps are pumping it back out.
Oh, other
Yeah.
channels.
Yeah.
are closed. That's
Oh, yeah. The sodium channels that allow the sodium in are closed, yeah. All right, so the conduction system of the heart is a series of, like I said, conducting cells. They're not necessarily neurons. They're heart muscle cells that have the ability to do this and generate action potential. It's interesting, you can take two cardiac cells, two conducting cells, and you can put them in a petri dish. They each generate their own action potential. In other words, they're not being told to do it, they just fire. And they each go at their own pace. But if they're in there together long enough, whoever's faster sets the pace. Like the Indy pace setting car. Whoever's faster sets the pace and the other cell will follow along. It's pretty amazing that they coordinate that well, even, in a total vacuum. Okay, so the same mechanism prevails here, so that if part of the conduction system fails, the rest of it can compensate. And we are very, very good at compensating. So the way that the electrical impulse travels, we start at our sinoatrial node. Now, again, this is not something you're gonna see on a model because it's not a discrete structure. It's a collection of cells that are able to conduct electricity by themselves. So the SA node is generally the pacemaker, and it's located up here in the right ventricle, and it fires, it sends its action, it starts an action potential, which then travels to what? It's right here in the atrium, yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah, atrium. It's been a long day. All right, so your SA node is up here. Excitation spreads through. Once the SA node fires, what happens to the muscle? It's gonna contract. So this electrical impulse spreads. It's not just at one point. It spreads through the whole atrial muscle. All right, so it's like an umbrella kind of effect. And the next place that it goes is to the AV node. So you've got action potential spreading across all of these muscle cells and then hitting the AV node here near the septum, and that excitation then spreads down the bundle of His and then up into these Purkinje fibers, which are in the ventricular walls. So you've got atrial electricity, then jump from the SA to the AV, down the septum, and then back up the sides. Make sense? So you have electrical impulse that starts here in the corner, spreads over the atria, and then jumps to the AV node here in the septum, and then the impulse goes down the septum and then back up the sides. So to the Purkinje fibers, these little fibers, and the bundle and the little fibers up in the walls.
Is it like a cycle, like when it comes down, the ventricle to the outside, does it go back to one?
Well, it kind of is, but it does, but the signal itself isn't being recycled. So think of it as like, the signal dissipates, and then the SA node generates another one. So you're generating a fresh signal every time.
So kind of like nerve synapse.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Okay.
Only you're not using a nerve and a synapse, you're using conducting cells. Okay? So really right now, it's about understanding what the action potential is. It's an electrical impulse that causes a muscle to contract. And then the next part of it is understanding where it's coming from, which is where? The SA node, and then what direction is it spreading? The atria, then down the septum, and up the sides. Okay? So, that's kind of how that goes. Notice the connective tissue in the muscle itself keeps this impulse from going anywhere else. In other words, it's not going to dissipate, and it's not going to jump to someplace it's not supposed to go. The connective tissue blocks the signal enough to where the AV node is a necessary target. So you're not losing electrical power, as it were, from that jump one to the other. Okay? All right. So it looks, I like this picture because it shows you the waves of depolarization that happen in purple. So if you follow the purple shows you where the electrical conduction is going. Does that help you visualize it a little bit? Okay, so we can measure this. You know, we said we were looking at something similar to an EKG here, but what does a real one look like? And again, we're kind of oversimplifying. If you work in a clinical setting, you know what a 12-lead EKG looks like. It's a hell of a lot more complicated than just one little line. But for our purposes, this will help us understand what it is we're measuring. So, who fires first? Where does our signal originate? At the SA node. And are we depolarizing or repolarizing? Depolarizing. Sodium channels open or closed? Open. So as the sodium channels open, our electrical impulse spreads across the atria. And that is the beginning of our first little wave here. This is our P wave. Atrial depolarization. Electrical impulse spreading through the atria. You see it? Okay. And then what happens, there's our completed wave. So at this point, what does the P wave tell you about what that heart is doing? It tells you nothing except the electrical impulse is happening. It doesn't say a word about contraction. You infer contraction based on the conduction, but the contraction at the top of the wave has not happened yet because there's a lag. Remember that lag period between the time the muscle cell gets zapped and the time it actually contracts? What was that called? Latent period. Yes, that's right. So it's the same, it takes a second for all of those ions to get in. So once you have your atrial depolarization, you only contract after that. There is no contraction without a signal. Alright, so then from the atria and the SA node, what fires next? Well, you've got the AV node here, and then you've got your bundle branches. So while we're on our way to the apex, we've got our Q wave. There's a slight dip there as those branches get ready to fire. And then we have our big QRS wave. And based on the purple in the picture, what does the QRS wave correspond to? Ventricular depolarization, not ventricular contraction. It's just the electrical signal in the ventricle. The contraction happens when? A split second after the signal, because it takes a second for it to react. So somewhere at the bottom of this QRS wave, you have ventricular contraction. And remember, again, there is no contraction without electrical impulse first. And then up here, as you are repolarizing and resetting, you have another slight increase or another slight depolarization as the ventricles reset, and that's your T wave. So what happens when you have an EKG that looks like this? Well, based on what you know about electrical conduction, what is or is not happening at this point? What should be happening at this big peak up here? This should be repolarization of the ventricles, i.e., what's another word for repolarizing? Think reset. You gotta reset. You gotta get the sodium back out so it can contract again. But what's happening here? It's not getting the chance to reset. Do you have electrical activity here? Yes, you've got a lot of it, but you're not having efficient pumping. These are also referred to as, this is an elevated ST segment. It's called a STEMI, elevated ST. But what it really is a tombstone, because anybody who's got this situation going is not pumping blood efficiently. Is their heart doing something? Yes, it's doing all this kind of stuff, but it's not doing this.
You said it was an elevated what?
ST segment. So from here, so there, you've got the QRS here, the ST segment's this little piece, and if you don't reset the ventricles, that piece happens up here. Right?
What's happening, you called it something else specific,
STEMI.
STEMI?
Yeah.
Yeah, where exactly did you say on the?
Oh, so the QRS here is the big wave, the S is just little bitty, you can see it better here. So then from the S to the T, this little piece right here is the piece that's elevated. It's way up here because the ventricles never did reset.
Okay, so the ST segment is from that S to right
T.
before the T?
Yep.
And the same as like the fibrillation.
That's the next thing. So if you do that, if you have enough of that, pretty soon you can start having something that looks like that. That's your fibrillation. VFib. Sometimes it's not that severe, sometimes it is. And again, what's gonna happen to this heart? Is it moving? Yeah, it looks like a bag of worms. It's doing this thing, but it's not doing this. How do you fix it?
Pacemaker?
Yeah, you can shock them. How else could you fix it? What if you don't have a machine?
Compressions?
And I'm not even joking. You give them a serious chest thump. The highlight of my husband's career. This man has saved countless lives. You know, he does all, you know, whatever. But he was in a cardiac unit that was all they did. And all of their defib machines were gone, and his patient started to crash, and they were like, do it, bam, and restarted the guy. That's crazy. Why does that work? What does the defibrillator do?
Reset the heart.
It shocks. Why? Wait a minute. If I'm having heart problems, I don't want to be shocked. Why does that work? You disrupt all of this electrical nonsense and reset it so that it goes back, hopefully, to its normal rhythm. How cool is that? And that's why people say understanding what the defib machine does, because people have this idea that it's an anti-death machine and they want to use it on everybody. It's not. It's for this electrical problems. That also explains why kids who play baseball wear heart guards. You heard of that? Little kids that get hit in the chest with a ball.